Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. We live in interesting times with a percentage of the population completely hysterical about climate. Voltaire said, "He who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." When people believe that their lives are imminently threatened, all other belief systems tend to go out the window. For many people, this includes losing their sense of morality or rational thinking. I realized about 10 years ago that climate alarmism was not about science. Here's an article from 9 years ago. Next climate warming report will be dramatically worse. UN, November 2010. United Nations leaders will demand concrete results from the looming Cancun Climate Summit as global warming is accelerating, a top UN organizer of the event said Monday. Robert Orr, UN Undersecretary General for Planning, said the next IPCC report on global warming will be much worse than the last one. Its next report, involving contributions from thousands of scientists around the world, is due in 2014. So this was 4 years before the report came out, and the scientists hadn't even done their research yet. Yet the politicians already knew the predetermined result. It was obvious that what we were dealing with was a massive propaganda and brainwashing campaign, not science. The name of the organization is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That gives us a pretty big clue of what their agenda is. It's not about scientists studying climate, it's about government pushing the idea of climate change. People walking around with signs that said the end is near used to be a rare oddity, but it's now mainstream thinking among progressives. Decades of brainwashing, going back to their elementary school days with Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, have made many people completely irrational. These people live longer, better, healthier, and more comfortable lives than any humans in history. Yet they imagine they're being killed by the very things which make their comfortable lifestyle possible. These people have no idea what it's like to be cold, living in the dark, or hungry, like just about every single generation of their predecessors did. They don't understand that fossil fuels are exactly the reason that they have the wonderful lifestyle which they do. German climate skeptic Pierre Gosling just made this disturbing blog post yesterday. Just like the 1930s, there's no question that freedom of science and speech are under heavy attack in Germany after dozens of distinguished but dissenting scientists have seen their long-planned science conference canceled due to intimidation by left-wing extremists. This was a planned meeting of scientists who don't support the alarmist agenda. The comparison to the 1930s in Germany is particularly disturbing for me, not only as a skeptic but also as a Jew. Millions of my people were murdered in Germany during the 1930s and the 1940s after a similar mass propaganda campaign. People in Germany were told by governmental authorities that Jews threatened their very existence and lifestyle. This government propaganda made many members of the public both hysterical and irrational. Now the target of their hatred isn't Jews, but rather anyone who tells the truth about climate. Bands of thugs are being used to enforce this hatred. These people are fascists who call themselves anti-fascists. During the 1930s, Germany had similar gangs of thugs. They were used to silence dissent and enforce the official government propaganda campaign. I'm a keen student of 1930s history. I spent hundreds of hours looking at newspaper articles from the 1930s. There was a tremendous amount of very extreme weather during the 1930s. It was by far the hottest decade on record in the United States. The deadliest flooding in human history occurred in China during the 1930s. Millions of people drowned in these floods. The worst droughts in U.S. history also occurred during the 1930s. 80% of the U.S. was in drought during July 85 years ago. The heat and drought led to massive dust storms. The U.S. also had some of its worst flooding on record during the 1930s. March 20th, 1936, all Eastern America under flood waters. President signs appeal as capital flooded, 100 cities and 14 states affected. This newspaper came out on the day when my grandfather had to be evacuated from a business meeting in downtown Pittsburgh by boat. The most intense hurricane in modern U.S. history occurred in 1935. It blew this train way off the tracks in the Florida Keys. And it wasn't just the US and China which were affected, there was a worldwide drought in 1934. Carbon dioxide levels are very low in the atmosphere during the 1930s, so climate models certainly can't explain the heat, drought, floods, and other horrific weather we had during that period. But this isn't about science or climate, it's about propaganda. July of 1930 had lots of reports like this about hundreds of people dying in the record heat around the country. And there were equally as many articles during the 1930s discussing the propaganda in Germany targeting the Jews. July 20th, 1934, Nazi press rages anew with bitter attacks on Jews. That was the same week as this article, and the same month as this drought. The ruling party in Germany made it very clear what their intentions were about the Jews. Their goal was to stimulate fear and hatred against Jews, leading up to what they called the final solution. But millions of Jews simply chose not to listen. They went on living their lives, doing their best to ignore the craziness going on around them, and then millions of them ended up paying with their lives later on. Fortunately, many Jewish scientists like Albert Einstein were listening. They left Germany and came to the United States. Einstein fled Germany in 1933 and came to work at Princeton University. This is a photograph of Dr. Will Happer and myself out in front of Einstein's house at Princeton. Dr. Happer is one of the leading experts in radiative transfer physics and is also a noted climate skeptic. In 1931, the consensus of German scientists attacked Albert Einstein's theory of relativity. They wrote a pamphlet, 100 Authors Against Einstein, basically a 99% consensus. Einstein responded by saying, "Why did they need 100? If I were wrong, all they would need was one." In doing so, he laid out exactly the arguments against consensus science. Hitler targeting the Jews proved to be very costly for his war effort. Einstein and many other Jewish scientists who fled Germany during the 1930s later became a critical part of the U.S. war effort during the 1940s. In 1939, Einstein and several other European scientists who had fled fascism sent this letter to President Roosevelt. The letter warned the president that Germany was developing an atomic bomb. This letter led to the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where I grew up. That project ended World War II. Another disturbing topic which Pierre Goslin discussed in his blog post was censorship in Germany. He linked to this article in Spiegel Online. 75% of journalists and writers in Germany are concerned about the state of free speech in that country. As Pierre points out, once again the parallels are very similar to the 1930s in Germany. Censorship played a big part in the rise of fascism. When your ideas don't hold up to scrutiny or debate, the only way you can get your agenda through is by silencing your critics and opponents. Censorship is once again a huge problem in Germany, and we're seeing the same dangerous tactics in the United States. Anthony Watts posted this blog post yesterday. An article from Vice is making very thinly veiled threats of physical violence against climate skeptics. Dr. John Christie at the University of Alabama at Huntsville is one of the world's leading experts on measuring global temperatures from satellites. Satellite temperature data does not support the idea that we're experiencing a climate crisis. But the agenda of climate alarmists has nothing to do with science or the climate. After an Earth Day march in Huntsville, people fired gunshots into Dr. Christie's office. Anthony Watts summed up the Vice article with these words: "Despite a failed assassination attempt, these climate deniers continue to impede global action." What they're trying to do is make unstable people like these hysterical and encourage them to use violence. Vice wants these kinds of people to believe that climate skeptics are a threat to their survival. This is once again very similar to what went on in Germany during the 1930s. But this time, instead of hatred against Jews, it's hatred of climate skeptics. I've also had death threats and people invoking violence against me on public forums. This poll is from a Facebook climate website where they asked the question if I should be tarred and feathered. I made a post on that Facebook site yesterday pointing out the overwhelming empirical evidence that life does extremely well at high levels of carbon dioxide. And this was the kind of response which I got. It's deniers like you, Tony, who are paid by fossil fuel companies. Scientists know what the temperatures were at different times, and they still say global warming is a crisis. So rather than discussing the important point I made, Eric Meese simply made up lies about me. I don't have any ties to fossil fuel companies. I'm a lifelong environmentalist, a full-time cyclist, and I would love to see 90% of the cars off the road. This information is well known, and it's ridiculous that climate alarmists are still using these sort of lies. NASA satellites show very clearly that life on Earth has benefited from the increase in carbon dioxide over the past 35 years. Earth has gotten much greener. There is no legitimate evidence that the increase in carbon dioxide over the past century has had any deleterious effects to life on Earth or to the climate. Science is not part of the agenda of the people pushing this hysteria. They seek power and control and are using fear and anger as their primary tool. This photograph is at the top of the Facebook climate discussion page. This is not about science, it's about a radical political agenda. This was a conversation I had with a clinical psychologist in Flagstaff, Arizona yesterday. He describes climate skeptics as being maggots. Dehumanizing the target of your hatred has always been a key tool of hate groups. It's much easier for most people to commit violence against other humans if they first convince themselves that the other people are not human. The climate scientists who've been promoting the global warming scare have lost control of the angry mob which they created. Catherine Hayhoe of Texas Tech University is a leading climate alarmist, and she's complaining about being attacked by climate activists for not being radical enough. And Michael Mann of Penn State University is similarly being attacked and discarded by climate activists. They don't need the scientists anymore. Their radical movement has taken on a life of its own. They simply don't need scientists anymore to push their agenda. I had the good fortune of watching Alex Epstein debate Robert Kennedy Jr. at the University of Colorado a few weeks ago. Alex did a great job and wooed a lot of the audience here in very liberal Boulder, Colorado. Before the debate, the University of Colorado was bragging about the open environment of free speech they allow on campus and discussing how unusual that was on college campuses these days. That's true, and it's very sad. College campuses used to be the place where young people went to learn and how to think. Now it's a place where they go to get indoctrinated. Many Jews in Germany during the 1930s chose to ignore the warning signs and paid a very high price for it later. As a keen student of history, particularly the 1930s, I'm unwilling to do that. Never again. People with a political agenda are inciting the angry mob, just like occurred in the 1930s. We should pay attention to what Pierre Goslin is telling us in this blog post. Voltaire had it exactly right. He who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Through a massive propaganda campaign waged over decades, climate alarmists are turning perfectly good people into climate crazies. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.